it's very clear now, particularly since the announcement of digital ID, that we are at a turning point in Britain, and whether we're going to stay basically a free country which abides by the principles of self-governance, or whether we're going to go down the road of centralised, top-down global governance, otherwise known as technocracy.
Alex Klaushofer says the approaching digital ID presents Britain with a choice: freedom or totalitarianism.
It's beyond all doubt to me now that the digital ID agenda is about centralised control, which involves money and resources as well. But the main idea is to get control over a population in a way that has never been possible before until the advent of digital technology.
Alex says despite attempts to manufacture consent, the British public does not support this.
There has been a very clear no. Obviously there's that petition which is heading towards 3 million, which is unusual for a petition to get that amount of support that quickly. The other notable thing is that the rejection of digital ID comes across the board from a wide range of people and even institutions now.
Alex explains how the move towards digital ID is already surreptitiously underway.
The first step of this comes with the requirement that company directors sign up to one login and re-verify themselves, because they will have already done that, via one login. Now, one login is the basis for the proposed BRIC card, and it is a centralised, interoperable system which will cross-populate all the data for each citizen.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders. I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with the author of Ways of Seeing Substack, Alex Klaushofer. Alex, welcome back.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So I wanted to talk with you about freedoms or unfreedoms. You cover a lot of this on your Substack. Can you start by giving us an introduction as to how you see the state of freedom in Britain at the moment?
I think we're at a crossroads. I may have said that for a while. I may be saying that along with a lot of other people for a while, because, you know, it's going to take time for us to work through this phase and decide as a country which fork in the road we're going to take. But it's very clear now, particularly since the announcement of digital ID, that we are at a turning point in Britain. Whether we're going to stay something which is maybe a liberal democracy, but whether or not that's the political system, whether we're going to stay basically a free country which abides by the principles of self-governance, or whether we're going to go down the road of centralised, top-down global governance, otherwise known as technocracy.
Do you think generally the people of Britain share a consensus on what freedom means?
That's a very interesting question. I think that's what we're working out now. Until 2020, I would have said yes. I would have said yes, we had a consensus on freedom of speech, we had a consensus on informed consent, and basic rights that you had: freedom of movement, the right to earn your living, freedom of association, all those kinds of things. Now I don't think we have that consensus anymore, notably in the area of freedom of speech, where we've seen a fundamental shift, probably over the last 10 years now, where individuals and institutions, as well as government and the top-down organisations, don't seem to agree on the well, let me put it this way. We've had a fundamental shift about what we can say and whether we can say things in public, and the reasoning behind that in the last decade. And on other things since COVID, yes, there's been huge shift. We've half forgotten informed consent. And so now we're in this situation where a lot of people are remembering, some people are talking and fighting very strongly, and other people are just kind of confused, I think. Plus a minority who are actively promoting what I would consider the anti-democratic, the technocratic path, although they may not realise that.
You mentioned the digital IDs. This was in September that the Prime Minister announced this. It was said it would help stop illegal immigration. What was your reaction to the announcement?
Well, I wasn't surprised because that's been pushed for a while. Tony Blair and his institute in particular has been advocating for that for a long time. And the most notable thing, if you've been following that at all, is that the arguments for digital ID always change. So the illegal immigration, and there is a very clear consensus in a large part of the population now about this, clearly digital ID will not help illegal immigration in any meaningful way, and that is part of the sell that the government and its associates, likes of Tony Blair and so on, are trying because it's an issue of popular concern. So they're basically just using an issue of popular concern to try to get enough tide of opinion to get the measure in, and then I assume they believe that, game over, they've got control.
What do you see as the real motives behind this announcement?
It's beyond all doubt to me now, and I have been through a long process of looking and following on this. It's beyond all doubt to me now that the digital ID agenda is about centralised control, which involves money and resources as well. But the main idea is to get control over a population in a way that has never been possible before until the advent of digital technology. And you can see that. It's very patent, not just in terms of the justifications, but in terms of in the few weeks since it's been announced, government and ministers have talked about so many different possible applications. And they change according to the week and where they think public opinion is moving that particular period. That it will be about right to work, yes, and then it will be about right to rent, and then it might be about getting a library card, and so on and so forth. Missing pieces on this is that it will definitely be connected to health data. And this is something that the Tony Blair Institute has been working on for some time. If you go and look at their website, and this is something that I've done for my Substack, you can chart almost the evolution of health policy, recent health policy in Britain, and the genesis of the NHS plan through policy documents written at the Tony Blair Institute, which link very much to technology and a monitoring and surveillance agenda. So, obvious examples of that would be wearables, and then the use of AI.
So wearables being?
Wearables being the kinds of things from Fitbits and Apple things, but actually things that are then possibly attached to you. I don't know much about this because I steer clear, but monitoring devices for diabetes, heart conditions, and so on. That's a major part of that. And that then links into surveillance and automated prescription through for vaccines and other treatments, some of which will be innovative. So you can see there's a lot of interests and different things going on there, which range from surveillance to strong commercial interests. And that then, those would link up to the NHS app, and that would come back to digital ID. And the thing that we're forgetting, many of us are forgetting in Britain at the moment, is that this has already been clearly stated from 2021 with vaccine passports. Tony Blair was advocating digital ID as a link to health certification. And since then, the World Health Organization and the EU have been working up a system which will link that. And a video that the EU put out some time ago about its own digital ID wallet portrays basically a day in the life of a young European in which everything is sort of lived through her smartphone, which provides a direct link to the government. And the first thing that she gets at the beginning of her day is a reminder to book her appointment for mandatory vaccination. And the day ends with her using her phone to be allowed to get access to a bar to her friends. Yeah. So, and then in between that, I think she's doing exams, using her phone to get, check in for her exams. There's no people in that video. All her interactions are between her and the phone, which links her to the state. So that for me was a forewarning. But if you link that back to what British ministers are saying and the likes of Tony Blair, it's just absolutely blatantly clear. They are telling us. Plus the fact that this is not a kind of verification system of the kind that most other countries or many other countries have. So when people in Britain say, oh, we're falling behind, or other countries have already got this, that is not true. They haven't. The systems that are comparable, that are centralised and interoperable, which cross-link all the information and the permissions on that for each individual citizen, are Estonia and India. And Estonia is a very different case because it's a very small country. It's 1.3 million citizens. I've actually been there. Funnily enough, I interviewed people in the government system who were, because they're very proud of their digital ID, because they were a small country that was coming out of Soviet control in the 90s, and they wanted to make their mark. So lots of small countries, they tend to sort of find something that they can do and then do it really well. So they chose digital technology as the way to do that, and they built what is the best working system so far, but with lots of safeguards, but it's still been hacked, and it was still the basis for vaccine passports. In fact, it enabled Estonia to be one of the leading countries introducing vaccine passports in COVID because of that system. And then the other comparable system, the British Prime Minister has recently been to India to see how that worked as a possible model for how it could be done in the UK. And that is a disaster. Aside from the issue of huge data leaks, 1.1 billion, and for sale on the dark web, there's been all sorts of problems where the system hasn't worked and people haven't been able to get pensions, they haven't been able to get food supplies, because India obviously is a very poor country. And the reason why the system was introduced officially was to smooth the access to welfare benefits and to kind of eliminate or reduce the corruption that was in that system. So, in fact, what it seems to have done is make it very arbitrary, and there are many well-documented cases of people not being able to get food or benefits because of that. Meanwhile, although it's still technically voluntary, so here's another lesson for the UK, it spread so very widely across Indian society since 2009 when it was introduced that even Amazon are asking it for tracking of tracking of deliveries. In the most mundane things, individuals ask for it. It's just spread across society so that people have great difficulty in functioning without it. So it's a real lesson. Don't trust someone when they say this will just be for that. History shows something like that. It will always expand once it's introduced.
Yeah. Can we look briefly at that kind of worst case scenario? I think we kind of have this in China already with the social credit system. What would life be like?
It's difficult to imagine. I don't like to do this too much because it is so negative, but we do need to think about it. I think it would be a social credit. It would be a form of a social credit system. It wouldn't be exactly like in China or any other country, because the other thing to be aware of is a system like this, it kind of maps onto and amplifies what is going on in that country already.
Right.
So if you look at things like restrictions to do with climate or the environment, say on mobility and cars, or if you look at things like carbon allowances. So there's been an uproar recently about Rainer sandwiches having a carbon allowance, dietary carbon allowance on them. And NatWest, I think, is now using Carbon Tracker. Things like that. So you think about that. It would likely be linked into that kind of system where you would effectively be given an allocation of the amount of movement you could do.
Like carbon credits.
Yeah, and then carbon credits, what and how you could live. Because you would be able to be monitored, and possibly even once, the technology is not there yet, but it presumably wouldn't take very long, you could be restricted on your movements without any external surveillance.
So here in Britain, I mean, do the public want this? And if the public don't, do you think they've made that known well enough?
I don't think the public want it at all. Increasingly, as people think about things, it's very clear. There has been a very clear no. Obviously, there's that petition, which is heading towards 3 million, which is unusual for a petition to get that amount of support that quickly. The other notable thing is that the rejection of digital ID comes across the board from a wide range of people and even institutions now. So it's very widespread. There never was any organic demand. It was always being generated by government, Tony Blair, and so on. So I think it's extremely clear that we've said no, and then we get to the point of, well, government isn't listening. What do you do? If you have a government in a democracy that doesn't listen, the question we're now facing in Britain is, what do we do about that?
Millions of people signed that petition and it just was ignored.
Yeah. It was more than ignored. It was, the government came straight back. I got the email like everybody else who signed the petition, which said we're going ahead anyway. And we keep getting these statements. Every time the information comes through, more feedback comes through about why people don't want it. Another thing we haven't quite mentioned is one login and the fact that it's completely insecure. That's been very widely covered in the press, so people don't know about that. I suggest you go and have a look. All that information, no responsible government should be promoting a system which has been exposed in this way. So even though they have this information, they're still trying to talk about, I think the latest thing is, it'll stop you rummaging in your drawer looking for ID. They're still giving things that are clearly, at best, very bad sales talk, and at worst, outright deceptions.
Do you think any consent is being manufactured for this?
Yes, I mean, this is a technique that we've been seeing for some time now. So the use of polls. Polling is a certain art, and you get results depending on what kinds of questions you ask, and often the samples are very small. And then there's things like focus groups, citizens' assemblies, and so on, which are very much set up to create the kind of result that is wanted. So the Climate Change Committee, for example, has made great use of these kinds of tactics to create the idea that there is consent for taxes on meat, or certain foods and that kind of thing, which you never ever hear an ordinary person say, oh, I'd really like a tax on meat. So, and then these kind of results are put in the mainstream media, and some publications are more critical than others, but then it's distributed across mass communications, and it kind of proliferates and creates the idea that, oh, this is something that people want and it's happening and it's sort of inevitable. But we really need to savvy up in this age where there are so many different ways that you can create impression, perception, information and spread information. We really need to wise up and see how things are being done.
You mentioned one login. Can you go into a bit more detail about what's already happened and where things are at with the digital ID stuff?
A lot of people think that digital ID is simply about brick card, and it is something that people will have to, unless they choose not to comply, sign up to whenever it's introduced in a few years' time. But the key thing to know is that digital ID is actually being already introduced by stealth. And the first step of this comes with the requirement that company directors sign up to one login and re-verify themselves, because they will have already done that, via one login. Now, one login is the basis for the proposed BRIC card, and it is a centralised, interoperable system which will cross-populate all the data for each citizen. So if you put your data in for taxes or as a company director, It will, not sure the technology is quite there yet, but the idea is that it will link up with every other government department and service. Right. Now that means that necessarily millions of people, potentially public service workers, will have access to that information. And then if you think about how public services are now increasingly working in partnership with third parties, including companies and research bodies, biotech companies, for example, that means that those people in those organisations too will have to have permission for that system. They may even be outside UK jurisdiction. So research has shown, there was a whistleblower which has been covered by the journalist Andrew Orlowski, shown that one login lacks even the most basic security features. It's already incredibly open to abuse. And of course then we've got the history of data leaks and hacks in other ways, of both British systems and other digital ID systems in Estonia and India. So the potential for data breaches is enormous. And with one login, the government is effectively trying to persuade people to sign up gradually. Firstly with company directors, and then another group will be next. I think it might be, say, sole traders, and then other taxpayers, and then perhaps benefit recipients of the state pension. I'm just guessing, but whatever and ever. So it's a creep until they think everybody will be on that system.
And the next rung just says, well, they did it, so we may as well do it, and it just carries on.
It just carries on until it's there de facto. So when I talk about understanding what digital ID is and the importance of non-compliance, it has to be applied to this as well. It's not some far-off point with BritCard, if that happens. So my sense is that what the government is doing is taking a two-pronged approach. The BritCard was the upfront thing. Some people say it's a PSYOP. I don't think necessarily it's that. I think it was a try-on. I'd call it a try-on. They think that because they got away with so much during COVID, and such a large proportion of the British population are not really paying attention to what's going on, that they will just go along with this idea that, oh, it's just more digital and it's nothing really and everybody in Europe has it. I hear people saying things like this. They think that people will accept that and speed the process up. But meanwhile, they're also gradually getting people onto this incredibly leaky, dysfunctional system through coercion. So we need to recognise that the coercion is here now. And I'm not telling people what to do, but I strongly suggest that each person has a think about what it is and what is going on in order to make their own personal decision about how to proceed and if there are any protections that they can take for themselves.
Yeah. If we look at, say, the lockdowns, and there was track and trace and tens of billions were spent on that, or even, say, HS2, do you think the government is actually capable of a project of this magnitude?
Not at all. There's all sorts of examples. We don't even have a linked-up digital system for the NHS. That's been tried before and failed at huge public cost. Yes, track and trace is a more recent example. So the hope is that, no, they can't. They can't do it and they won't be able to do it. However, at some point, the technology will be there. So the fact that Britain is particularly bad at this kind of thing, whereas, say, Estonia or perhaps China are better, is not a reason for us to just sit back and watch it collapse. We need to be having a proper grown-up think about how we want technology to be used. So one point that is made very, very rarely is that we, as a species and in the West, we are so new to digital technology. And if you look at it, all the evidence is that we're not very good at using it. You know, from social media trolls to governments censoring and controlling, it doesn't look like we've arrived at a place yet where we've worked out how to use what could be a great technology and does have fantastic uses, how we're going to use it for the good of humanity. So given that, it does not look like a good idea, whatever the circumstances, to rush headlong into a system where you connect every aspect of human life up to digital. We clearly need a process, a time of learning and integration and questioning, rather than what we're doing now with digital ID and also censorship.
So what do we do now? How does non-compliance work in this scenario?
So people are now talking about non-compliance a lot in the light of mandatory digital ID, and I think that's really important and probably the key to seeing it off and having a good future rather than a bleak technocratic one. The question is what non-compliance is, and I think in this country we've forgotten really what it is, and there are a couple of misconceptions about it that I hear from people. One is that there's a kind of easy solution. There's something that you can do that will just get you out of this. So people tend to ask organisations or even individuals on social media, what can we do? Tell me what to do. As if they will have the answer, which that individual can then apply and get out of the situation without any discomfort. That's not the case. So the first thing is that non-compliance generally, by its nature and what it indicates about the situation that you're in, involves some discomfort and uncertainty. And the other thing is that there isn't actually, in any situation, one particular thing or set of things that exist as if on a template, what you can do. When you look at how non-compliance has worked in the history, it's always evolving, changing, a bit of a muddle, you could say. It's grown out of a particular situation in a particular society with particular people at a particular time. So recently I went and read Martin Luther King's account of how he organised the bus boycott in 1955. We tend to think of that as a kind of finished thing where they did this and, you know, then civil rights happened for everybody. But actually, it was a really confusing time where he was making decisions and judgments on the hoof. He had doubts and uncertainties. He was working with a community that in this case supported him and then authorities that were against him. But it all came together very fast. And they had to make decisions as they went about what they were going to do. In Britain, we actually do have a very rich history of non-compliance. One main one would be the conscientious objectors of First World War, who just said, no, for reasons of conscience and principle, I'm not going to go and fight. So that's a good example to think about. And before that, we've got a history, long history connected with our religious history of people being excluded from mainstream society because they had the wrong belief. So part of the English side of my family comes from a line of nonconformists. So I know a bit about how they developed their own universities and educational establishments, even lived in separate areas, and basically kind of created what you'd now call a parallel society, which is very interesting. So it has been done before. Of course, then digital wasn't around, so it was much easier. But then more recently, in Britain and in other Western countries, we've had a huge example of non-compliance in vaccine passports. So when they came in across much of the Western world, I was living in Portugal, and we had about 3 days' notice of them. It was a surprise. There was no discussion that they were on the way. I can't prove this, but I personally think there was pressure from outside Portugal to impose them. And they were widespread. They were across most hospitality, it was all very complicated and typically Portuguese, and there were sort of bureaucratic rules that didn't really make sense, that if you were registered as a restaurant or a cafe and this time and that time you did or didn't need a vaccine passport. But basically they meant that people who didn't want to show documents to eat, which was my basic position, I took the view that my medical information was nobody's business except mine and medical people's, certainly not people serving coffee, that if you didn't want to participate in that system, you couldn't do very much at all, officially. But we soon found the establishments that weren't complying, and after 3 or 4 months, the government cancelled them, saying that one of the reasons for that was that they were not being enforced properly. Now, Portugal is an interesting case because it had Europe's longest running dictatorship. And what I noticed from living there is that people were very compliant on the surface, in that they were very concerned about being seen to be doing the right things and what the police would do or say, but they didn't actually comply or believe in many things in an underlying basis. And at the same time, I was in online meetings with people in countries where vaccine passports were imposed so harshly, such as France, Germany, Austria, that they couldn't do anything, lost their jobs. People who had made that decision and made that sacrifice because they believed so deeply that it was wrong and they understood the consequences of going along with something like that deeply. It was really, really painful seeing people either in tears or mostly trying to be brave because they couldn't go out. They'd been cut off from their livelihood, their friends and family. But it worked. It worked. So Austria is a case in point. That was the only country that tried to impose mandatory vaccination. I followed this quite a lot because I'm half Austrian. And around a third of Austrians just refused. And so at the last minute, it was changed. So the key lesson there is that if enough people say no, it cannot happen. And that's what we need to take heart from in Britain, and remember that.
Join us for part 2 when Alex talks about Ofcom's increasing censorship powers.
We have what is effectively a policeman of the internet, not just in Britain, but which currently believes it has the ability to regulate, effectively means censor, the internet all over the world.